I need to know everything, who and the what and the where, I need everything. Trust me, I hear what you're saying, but act like it's new what you're telling me. I'm curious, George, I hop in the Porsche, it's 5 and a horse, I'm ready for war, I'm coming for throats, to turn to a ghost, I need to know everything.
Okay, hello and welcome to the Counter Narrative Show. I am your host, Rasheem. Today we will be discussing an article, an amazing, well-written article by one of my favorite people to have on the Counter Narrative Show. This article was written by Davon Love. The title of the article is Cracker Democracy: The Emergence of the Progressive Mainstream. A little bit of background about Davon, if you don't know him already. Davon Love is the Director of Public Policy for Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle. In 2010, Davon co-founded Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle. Like other members of LBS, Davon believes that all groups and campaigns that endeavor to fix policies that harm predominantly African-American communities must be led by African-American communities. In Baltimore, that covers a bevy of issues, including affordable housing, economic development, education, and criminal justice reform. Davon, thank you so much for being here yet again. I never get tired of having you here. Thank you.
I love being on. I appreciate the invitation.
So one of the things that I really appreciate about your work is that when I read it, I'm regularly reminded of the ways in which white progressive nonprofit organizations' existence and other helping professions, like, for example, social work, have a high economic reliance on Black suffering and I would say crisis management. Thank you, computer. I would say crisis management, and yours, I think you refer to it as disaster management. I feel like you highlight that very well. And I also love the ways in which you communicate the nuances of design and social justice issues in organizations that make me feel like you are talking to me, and even more like you're talking to Black people as a collective. Like, we're going to have a family meeting about this. Let me tell you what's going on. If other people want to listen, that's fine, but I'm talking to you. And that's not often that I read something that's talking about these issues where I feel like it's talking to me. A lot of times I feel like it's talking to white people about how to be better and interact. So I appreciate you for that. I want to say that from my personal experience of reading your work. So in this particular piece, Cracker Democracy: The Emergence of the Progressive Mainstream, if folks have not checked that out already, go ahead and Google, or you could go to Leaders LBS Baltimore. Is it right. .com?
.com, yep.
.com, and check this out. So there's 5 main things that come up for me in reading this. So I'm gonna have our conversation kind of be guided by those 5 things that come up. So one, it reminds me, I mentioned to you earlier before we started, it reminds me of the colonization of radical politics, a post that you, an article that you wrote, I think in the summer.
That's right.
I remember reading it. So it reminds me of the colonization of radical politics. It reminds me of, another point of this article is connected to me in my thinking, a fear of Black self-determination, that there's this just like active resistance to it. Also, it brings up for me some of the dangers of multiculturalism. I go back to thinking of some previous conversations around UNIA, NAACP, and the origins and the shifts with that. It makes me think of that. I also start to think about disaster management, and then I also think about plantation structure and how that exists in Baltimore. So that's like 5 things from my reading that come to the surface that other things fit under. So I'm gonna let our conversation kind of be guided by those 5 elements. Folks, as you are listening, if you have any questions for Davon, please feel free to put them in the chat, and I'll be sure to get to those questions when I am able. So let's start with the first, of course, most obvious question. What is cracker democracy?
So that's a phrase that I borrowed from Hubert Henry Harrison, a person I actually like to quote, because Hubert Henry Harrison was an early 20th century political organizer and intellectual. And in fact, he was one of the towering intellectuals of his time. Some argue that he was a major force in what we call the Harlem Renaissance, or the New Negro movement. And what's interesting about Hubert Henry Harrison is that he comes out of the Socialist Party. And he, while being in the Socialist Party, being an active socialist, he became frustrated with the socialists, because while they argued for, while they would, state their stated beliefs was in equality and liberation and all the like, his essential critique of them is that they resisted formations of Black self-determination, and that they were more focused on democracy as it related to white folks. And even though they talked about freedom and equality, the way they structured their organizations, the nature of their political activity was such that Black folks were rendered as second-class citizenship. And so, he moved into the Universal Negro Improvement Association. Marcus Garvey, he at one point was the editor of the Negro World. And so he moved more into kind of autonomous Black formations. And the critique of, again, another aspect of the critique of the Socialist Party, his argument was that they're race first, the white race first, even though they talk about socialism. And so his book, When Africa Awakes, is essentially a collection of his texts where he's criticizing folks who claim to be friends to Black people as to their shortcomings. And so in that text, he talks about this notion of cracker democracy. One of the people he actually criticized was W.E.B. Du Bois. Du Bois wrote a piece called Closed Ranks, where it was his plea for Black people to kind of cease political agitation against, the American nation state, come together for World War I. And when folks come back, we would get the kind of citizenship we deserve. And so Hubert Henry Harrison criticized Du Bois and said that he shouldn't say that to the masses of Black people. Why should they fight for democracy abroad when Black people don't have democracy here? And so within that, he talks about this notion in the text of When Africa Awakes, he talks about this notion of cracker democracy. He talks about Haiti, which at the time of the eve of World War I had been invaded by the United States, and without any kind of declaration of war, without any real cause. And his point, Haiti represents an important aspect of the history of Black people in the world, and particularly in the Western Hemisphere, Haiti being a Black republic established as a result of overthrowing really two of the most powerful colonial powers in the world at the time, French and British Empire. And so that independent republic, and the way that it did so through warfare against those colonial powers, was an inspiration of people of African descent to agitate for freedom, take up arms against chattel slavery. And so Haiti serves as an inspiration for Black sovereignty. And so the idea of the United States invading Haiti just at its own whim, in many respects, is a desecration of one of the key symbols of Black autonomy. And then he goes on to say in the quote that I use, that democracy, essentially for white folks, is democracy to the extent that it benefits them. And that oftentimes when they speak of democracy, they're not talking about us and other non-white peoples. And so oftentimes that notion, cracker democracy, he's describing, what some people characterize as more of a Southern mentality. My point was to take that term and apply it in kind of a progressive political arena, where many folks wouldn't think to place it because of how folks in the kind of progressive environment see themselves as enlightened on race. I wanted to show how the term cracker democracy actually applies to an environment that for a lot of those folks would be appalled at the notion that kind of frame or phrase would apply to them.
What in that, because I read a bit of, when I saw the quote, because the quote comes up at the top, and I read the full quote, and it's a real confrontation of white supremacy, I feel like, and one that I definitely don't see now, and surprised, just like, wow, this happened at that particular time. What does it take for us now to kind of confront that level of white supremacy? Because I think Yeah, I'll just leave it at that. What does it take for us to really confront that right now?
That's actually a really important question, because for a couple of reasons. One, a part of, for me, calling it, like wanting to title the piece Cracker Democracy, there's some people who I think would agree with me in terms of the substance, but aren't positioned in a way to put something like that out and not affect their livelihood, right? And that's something that we wanted to really demonstrate. Like at LBS, as an independent Black grassroots political organization, the importance of being able to be direct in disrupting the hegemony that white supremacy has over how people talk, the limits to what people can say in kind of professional environments. Because there's an entire kind of academic, intellectual universe, whether it's in universities and nonprofits, online. But when you actually talk about spaces where they're determining where resources go, right, and determining policy, often the kinds of things that people would say they agree with, they may not necessarily be able to represent that kind of position in those kind of elite policymaking spaces, or spaces where determination of resources is happening. And so in terms of what it takes to really confront white supremacy, you have to have some modicum of autonomy and independence. Otherwise, what many of us find ourselves doing is kind of tinkering at the edges in terms of trying to, extracting whatever modicum of resources and help we can give to our community. And I want to be clear, not to, not to minimize the fact that there are people for whom they find their role to be to extract what they can from these major institutions. But if we're talking about Black liberation, right, which is different. When we're talking about Black liberation and confronting the system of white supremacy, that confrontation, you have to have, a strong base of autonomy and self-determination. Otherwise, the powers that be will make phone calls to mess your money up, will engage in some kind of, media smear where people try to smear your reputation, all manner of attack that if you don't have autonomy, if you don't have a base, you're not able to really confront the system of white supremacy in a real way.
So when it comes to like Black political liberation, what exactly is that a Black political party? Is that having a Black political agenda that most of us agree upon? What does Black liberation look like in a political from a political standpoint?
So one of the things that I'm learning, and it's a part of why I wrote the piece, is that when it comes to actual political participation, you think about, there are organizations that represent the interests of Black people and policymaking spaces. Normally, those organizations are not owned, controlled, or operated by Black people, right? And they may be well-meaning, right? As a person that does legislative advocacy, I partner with many organizations for whom are not owned, controlled, and operated by Black folks, right? But what that says is that ultimately, those are institutions that their ultimate accountability are to the folks on their boards of directors,
right?
Many of them proximate to the corporate sector. That's important because that places limitations on what you can really do. And so when we talk about, what it means, like Black political participation, the question we need to ask ourselves is, well, on what terms are we able to enter or participate in political spaces? And the reality is that for many of us, our ability to participate politically and to actually be in a position to make a difference, to move policy, for many of us has to do with the extent to which we are proximate to institutions that have a platform, that have access to resources, that are connected to networks that move policy. So the ultimate expression of Black liberation in politics is the ability to be, is the ability to impact policy and affect the distribution of resources while being able to express and advance an agenda centered around Black self-determination. And unfortunately, a lot of what we get is we get folks that can talk about racism, right? They can talk about Black people suffering. They can talk about issues that harm Black people, But what they can't do is move policy that either puts resources directly in the hands of Black folks to fix our own problems, or be able to shift policy in a way that undermines the power of institutions that assail our humanity. And if I can use one example, because it's fresh in my mind, it's work that I'm doing. I mentioned right before we got on air, right now I'm really busy with the Maryland General Assembly, right, and doing legislative advocacy. And one of the big issues we're working on is police accountability. And, one of the things that happens a lot on the issue of police accountability, there's a lot of conversation about body cameras, right? Police training, right? But what doesn't, and those are the kinds of demands that are rooted in a notion of, as Black people, we need to plead to white folks to recognize our humanity.
Right.
Right. We need to get them to stop killing us. Right. And that frame is a frame that is more palatable. It's a frame that I think many nonprofits, right, it's more palatable, right? Because that doesn't shift power. You're asking white folks to chill, essentially. That's different from a paradigm that says, let's build the institutions, build the capacity to levy consequences against those that harm our community, right? That's a very different point of view. And so LBS, one of the core aspects of our advocacy in Annapolis has been about the ability for a jurisdiction to establish a community oversight body that can impose discipline and adjudicate discipline for police officers alleged to have engaged in brutality and misconduct, right? I'm sure for many of your listeners, that's a pretty tame, straightforward, reasonable demand. If you go to our Facebook page and our website, we actually spliced a video of a Republican state senator from Harford County, Bob Casserly, who characterized the notion of community control over law enforcement as a kangaroo court.
Oh, wow.
And he thought his in the way he put it, he was shocked that would even be put in a bill. He was just shocked. He was, and you could tell he's actively, it bothers him. It offends his sense of the position that law enforcement plays. So I say that to say this, is that's one of the key differences. That for us, when we talk about Black liberation, what's going to give us power over the institutions that govern our lives? What's going to give us power over the police that are brutalizing our community, right? Sure, body cameras, because we want to be able to see what they do. Sure, police training, because we want them to be trained to be better. But if we're talking about Black liberation is about how do we give Black people more power to be able to, protect our own interests, as opposed to relying on external institutions and relying on them to do better by us.
I feel like, yes, and I feel like when you say that, though, with us getting the power, if they have the power, I can see why people are like, I have to go to them and tell them, please, will you give me power? Because even, and the infrastructure or the resources to build an alternative. And how long does it take to build an alternative? And I feel like that there's a way in which I feel like there's probably some people who are trying to do that in a way perpetuates this paternalism between white savior and Black people asking for you to yield things. Like, how do you balance that?
Right. And that's such an important piece, the piece around building the alternative. Because I think there's some folks with, kind of with our political sensibility for whom we'll just say we need our own stuff, but haven't actually built an institution, right? Haven't actually built a thing, right? And I think one of the things that I think is important again, if we have Black liberation as a paradigm for politics, we need to advocate for more resources to be able to invest in building those alternatives. And one of the things that happens, you think about something like law enforcement, takes up $500 million of the city's budget, a third of the city's budget essentially goes to police. A part of the question to ask ourselves is, well, how do we fund the building of these alternative systems? See, a lot of times we get asked, we say we want something to happen, and then we get asked to do it with no infrastructure or resources.
Right.
All right, you don't like the police. All right, then go fix the problem.
Right.
As opposed to, we need the resources, we need the infrastructure to build the alternatives. And and so it's one of those things where it's like, yeah, we are engaged in an effort. It doesn't immediately solve the problem. Oh, it doesn't work. Whereas all these other systems have had all this time and all these resources invested in
And they're failing.
and they're failing.
That.
And their family. Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And so we need the space as a community, not only to build the alternatives, but have the space, resource, and quite frankly, grace that many of the mainstream institutions get, to build these institutions, to get it wrong sometimes and be able to fix it. But to be able to build these alternatives, because to your point, we've had 60 years of the current iteration of police and law enforcement, 60 years of the kind of modern version of the welfare system, of the human social service system. Those systems have had time and space. If they were going to accomplish what they said they were going to accomplish, they would have done it by now. And so I think we need, and to me, that's what Black liberation is about, is we need to do the work so that we can build our own systems, as opposed to what I think some others are doing. And part of what I criticize in the piece, the progressive mainstream is about, trying to invest in more social programs that are still embedded in systems that are engaged in disaster management. We need to build our own alternatives to that.
Mm-hmm. You talk a bit, or at least reference a bit in the article about plantation structure, and you make some connections between plantation structure and how it's played out in Baltimore. Can you say a little bit about what exactly is plantation structure, and what are some examples that you're seeing that acted out in Baltimore?
So again, using Hubert Henry Harrison in Negro in the Nation, one of the things he says that I think is so important, so foundational. And I actually use this in it's a book that I wrote in 2018, Worse Than Trump, where I talk extensively about this plantation metaphor. He says, chattel slavery was slavery enforced by brute force. That's what we had before the Civil War. After the Civil War was wage slavery, which is enforced by starvation. And for me, that's a really important piece when we talk about the plantation structure, because the wage slavery that Hubert Henry Harrison is talking about, and it being enforced by starvation, if we're honest, a big part of how the system in this city gets maintained is the ability for people in high places to impact a person's livelihood, right? Can I give or take this grant based on whether you comply to a certain set of players who are going to be posted and put in power? Are you going to get that campaign donation, right? Are you going to get that major endorsement? Are you going to get that major contract? And so there's a way in which those in positions of power use their ability to impact people's livelihood in order to keep the current system as it exists. And, this isn't quite a tangent, but I think it's something that's relevant to what we're talking about. I'm sure a lot of people have seen, Judas and the Black Messiah. And, one of the things that I've heard a lot of is people kind of moralize on William O'Neill. He was a sellout. And see, to me, I think what people are missing is that he was working for white folks. It was either jail or this gig that he got. And I think there are some people that aren't honest enough with themselves to say, if you were in that predicament, would you do the same thing? And so the reason why the plantation metaphor is important is because it helps us to understand that it's structural. Sometimes we make it out to be, and there's some aspects of it that are about character, but I think it gets too much reduced to character, right? People are corrupt, so they don't want to help the community. That's more than likely not the case. And as a person who interacts with a lot of people who are in elected office, I've had lots of private conversations with people in elected office who say to me versions of, I want to do that, but if I do that,
right,
I'm not going to be able to do this other thing that I'm trying to do for the community, right? And so it's structural. It is that people's livelihoods are impacted by the way that these institutions want to maintain the structures that they have. And so it's important for people to understand how ubiquitous it is. But the other thing is that people are real good about making sure that the general public doesn't know. And that's one of the things that I think, at least for LBS, like one of the things that we want to try to put out there is to tell people that, there are folks who are threatened. There are folks whose livelihoods are threatened. I've had people tell me I've had people tell me, like even like program officers, numerous program officers in foundations, say things to me like, I like what you do, but if I support what you're doing openly, I'll get fired. Right. And I'm sure, I'm not the only person that hears that. Right. And so that's really how the plantation, structure operates in this thing.
Yeah, I really love that you used the guy who's characterized as Judas in Judas and the Messiah, because he's threatened with imprisonment. Other people could be threatened with the demotion. You know what I mean? So I think that helps to really, I don't know, I feel like it helps to really put it in context and really ask that serious conversation. One of the things that that I definitely got from reading your article, and that article for folks who are just tuning in is Cracker Democracy, the Emergence of the Progressive Mainstream. Could you speak more about the dangers of things like diversity, equity, and inclusion going mainstream? A person might argue, of course we want that mainstream. Why wouldn't we want that to be mainstream, a mainstream concept? Can you talk about some of the dangers of that?
Yep. So one of the things that I think happens, particularly in intellectual spaces or kind of overly intellectualized nonprofit spaces, is that people will talk about principles or statements that people adhere to and believe in, but it doesn't necessarily match the reality. And so what I've observed is that there are lots of people who will talk about multiracial, democratic institutions, advocacy, et cetera. But oftentimes the reality is that those who own the apparatus that operationalizes the particular multiracial democratic advocacy is owned, controlled by white folks who have an interest in maintaining control of that apparatus, right? And so I think it's important, and we talk about like racial coalitions. For Black people, I think a prerequisite to true multiracial coalitions is for us to engage those coalitions having our own institutional infrastructure, such that in those multiracial coalitions, we're in them from a position of strength. So that if there are things that undermine our own interests, we can pull out, and we can pull out in a way where we're not worried about losing our money or losing whatever platform we have that come as a result of an infrastructure we don't own and control. And I think in Baltimore, there's a lot of that. I mean, so much of the political machinery, and maybe even almost all of the political machinery that exists in Baltimore that has mainstream viability, we don't control. We may have, a seat on the board, right? Or we may have, a management level staffer or a senior level person. But in terms of like stuff that's ours, we don't have enough of that. And one of the things that I urge that we at LBS urge the community to do is to think more about how do we build stuff that's ours,
right? Such
that we don't have to be isolated, right? But build stuff that's ours so that when we join efforts, we're coming to it with something that is our own.
What about that in the face of something that is urgent, right? Like the urgency of now. So like, for example, building a coalition with, let's say if it was Black and brown people around something that is impacting both of our communities. I mean, would the response to them be wait until you both have your own individual separate infrastructures to join together and to combat this issue? Like how would you suggest people handle the urgency of like, right now, this is impacting me and I don't have the structure?
Right. So I would say a couple of things. One is that I do think that people have to use their judgment about what they think is the best way to address a problem that is before them. Right. So I don't blame people who make a determination that given the resources available to them, that this is the way to solve this immediate problem. Right. But there are two things though that happen that often gets used as a cover for. One is sometimes there are people who say that and their intention is to never do anything about it. Right. So they'll say, and in many cases rightly say, well, Davon, this is all we got. We got to do this. This is the best way to address it. But they have no intention on putting equal energy into building something independent. So we're not in that predicament. Right. The other thing that happens is that we oftentimes are asked to leverage, or we're asked to prioritize short-term things that get in the way of long-term planning, right? Because it's one of those things where if you keep planning for tomorrow and only tomorrow, you're not going to be able to plan for 2 years from now. And if you order your steps always thinking about right now, then we're not going to be able to really think about 2 years from now. So it's a balance of what are we doing in the short term that is an investment in the long term, the ability to be autonomous. And I think one of the issues we face is that we get so caught up in the short term. You know, there are times when people will say, yeah, they want people to die right now. We just got to do X, Y, Z. And it's like, this is a protracted struggle. Would we rather try to just put some bandages on something now and only be able to do that? Or do we want to invest in our ability to, at some point, be able to thrive and be proactive about our ability to thrive and protect our interests? And I think this is a part of the thing that I think folks we got to be honest about, is that, you know, I think for some people, the idea of Black folks having power institutionally is a frightening idea. Some of us have internalized the notion of anti-Blackness so much that for some people it's offensive, right? One way that I put it is there's some people who are suing for peace. They're like, we can't win. So your best bet is to sue for peace. And they mean well. And I think they're, you know, a lot of them, they would say, Davon, look, we can't win. Why are you doing that? We can't win. You know, you need to sue for peace. And I think that we have to confront that mentality in our community, because I think that's a part of what undermines our ability to really focus on being autonomous and independent.
Right. And I feel like it also, I mean, it does a multitude of things, right? It promotes that or prolongs that disaster management, because I just need to fix whatever the situation is right now. And I feel like one of the things that happens too, when we were talking earlier about things like DEI going mainstream and petitioning, things connected to petitioning white people to like not to be humans to other humans. I think one of the things that ends up happening is if they do anything, there's a celebration of monument. There's like a monumental celebration over the smallest thing. And so that looks and feels like progress. And so I feel like for that, if you or someone like you comes along and say, this is not progress, what you really should be doing is focusing on this, you're disruptive, you're a troublemaker, you're, you know, all of these other things. I'm really curious about some of the ways in which you feel like the reason that Black self-determination or Black autonomy is such a threat. Like, why?
Yep. So a few things. One is I name a few institutions in the piece that I described as anchors of the progressive mainstream. You know, talking about Progressive Maryland, the SEIU, Brent Emma's, Real News, as examples, right? And these aren't like end all be all, but they're examples of institutions that would describe themselves as progressive. That if you look at their policy platforms, the things they support are in that progressive radical category. But when it comes to Black self-determination, Pan-Africanism, autonomy, that there is either a deafening silence on things that fall under that genre of political activity, and in many cases, hostility to that. And so a part of that is that there are folks, as you talked about in the beginning, there are a variety of industries that benefit from Black suffering. And so when you think of, so for instance, take something like Medicare for all, right? Just something I mentioned in the piece. Medicare for all, as a matter of policy, is good policy generally, right? question we should ask ourselves is, well, who and what are the kinds of institutions likely to benefit? Many of the institutions that benefit are in the healthcare field. And in the healthcare field, when you think about some of the issues that Black people face in the healthcare field, expanding Medicare for all doesn't address some of the ways in which the medical industry is harmful to Black people, right? Raising that is disruptive to people who are advocating for Medicare for all. Because what people will say is, well, Dave, it's good policy. Expanding Medicare, that's good. And so for me, the question becomes, well, it's good, but who is it mostly good for and at what cost? And so this goes back to the disaster management piece. Same thing about things like public education. People will say we need to invest more in public education. Most Black folks I know, particularly in Baltimore City, doesn't matter how much money you put in Baltimore City public schools, they don't have trust that it'll provide quality education to their kids, right? And so while investing more money in public schools is good policy, right? If we raise the question of, well, the pedagogical and curricular practices used in schools are rooted in white supremacy, and we need to have Black formations that specialize in the socialization and educating Black youth at the center of public education practice, all of the kind of white ed reform-led institutions cease to have any relevance, aren't relevant in terms of getting grants because the whole paradigm would have been shifted.
Right.
So the progressive mainstream, while in many cases support good policy, one of the things that I argue is that in many times it is those who are employed by these industries who benefit more from the progressive policies, than the people actually being served. And so when we talk about Black self-determination, that gets at the heart of many of the things that would be necessary for these industries to be responsive to Black people. But again, it would also shift the nature of where resources flow. And so that's why you don't hear in a lot of progressive spaces, talk about, well, we need to invest in Black people's independent ability to be politically viable. Right. And so I think, that's a key piece of it. The other piece, so there's that. The other piece is this. The other piece is how people are socialized to think about politics. And the piece I talk about, those, and it's a vast oversimplification, but I think it helps make the point that there are folks who are socialized in an integrationist historiography, right? Meaning that the narrative that is told about how Black people make progress is by Black people petitioning society for our freedom.
Right.
So whether you look at like the civil rights movement, white people saw on television, Black people getting beat up, they recognized our humanity. King appealed so much to the consciousness of white people, made them change. Even when you talk about like enslavement, the Civil War, the North was fighting against slavery, just out of their own kind of benevolence, leaving out the fact that they were scared into doing that in many respects, because Nat Turner, Gabriel Prosser, Haiti, all the other uprisings.
Also,
that made it.
The demonizing of like anything that's Pan-African or Black nationalist as too angry, too whatever. By contrast,
Exactly. And so for some people, their socialization, having an integrationist socialization, it makes rational the notion that a Pan-Africanist methodology is angry, mean, separatist, because that's how people are socialized, right? Like there's an article I criticized in there. It's an article written by Lisa Snowden McCrae at The Real News about John Lewis and about the funeral and about Clinton's attack on Stokely Carmichael, Kwame Ture. She argues that that John Lewis kind of represents many of the protesters that would be characterized as good trouble. And what I argue is she's right in that many of the protesters would kind of fall into the category of what John Lewis represented. And they would be different from a Stokely Carmichael, Kwame Ture. Clinton found John Lewis to be less of a threat than Kwame Ture because of the integrationism that's at the core of John Lewis's advocacy versus the Pan-Africanism of Kwame Ture. And leaving that part out, it isn't historically complete, right? Because if you leave that part out, it's instructive then for, okay, well then what kinds of politics are truly radical and for Black people, right? Mm-hmm. And so the piece about Stokely Carmichael being about Pan-Africanism, it helps to put in perspective why the notion of Black self-determination is so dangerous. Mm-hmm. Because Clinton would never go to Kwame Ture's funeral and give a eulogy. Right. That would be too threatening to the nation state. But you can do that with John Lewis. And progressives can latch on to John Lewis because it doesn't threaten their position as being participants in or owning the machinery for advocacy for Black people.
Yeah. With that in mind, what do you think about, and this is something that I've just like been toying around in my head, what do you think about the ways in which people are readily trending and embracing Black Lives Matter, but today, and still have a resistance to like 1970s Black power? There are people who are very much more comfortable with Black Lives Matter they are completely uncomfortable with saying something like Black power. What do you make of that?
It's one of the things that, because I know a lot of people on a national level that, connected to Black Lives Matter, movement for Black Lives. And so I think many of the folks who are in those formations are sincere and mean well. I think one of the things that often bothers me, though, about how many of them have marketed themselves and the phrases they latch onto, things like "I can't breathe" or "hands up, don't shoot," pleading for Black people not to do harm. Mm-hmm. And I think it instills a mentality, and of course white folks are going to be more okay with that. Mm-hmm. And whereas Black power, it means exactly that, right? You gonna do something to me, I have the power to do something back.
Right.
And I think that, and see, that's one of the things that's actually really fascinating, is that I remember in doing I'm working on something that will take me a few months to finish, that looks at the way in which society looks at violence when it comes to Black people and against Black people. And I found a news article from the week that Nat Turner's rebellion in 1831 happened. Mm-hmm. And the news article, this is a Virginia local newspaper, describes Nat Turner and his comrades as, mean-hearted savages, mm-hmm. Who, loved violence and craved and were bloodthirsty. If you step back and you just think, these are people who are enslaved, who are rebelling against people who are oppressing them. Right. So to take that position means that the notion, it normalizes the idea that Black people should be oppressed, mm-hmm. right? And that any violence that we use should be considered a sign of inherent violence and aggression. So when people characterize Black power as angry and aggressive, they themselves are operating from a white supremacist historiography, right? Because only that frame would make it seem legitimate to call Nat Turner, an immoral person, mm-hmm. for doing what most peoples do when they're being oppressed, mm-hmm. which is fight back against the people that are committing harm to them. So I think so to your point, I think what has happened is that there are some people that will appropriate some of the rhetoric, mm-hmm. and even some of the figures. Mm-hmm. Like I get annoyed a lot when I see these Assata Taughton shirts. Mm-hmm. You know what I'm saying? Because if you read Assata's work, she's talking about people, she's talking about armed resistance and self-defense, mm-hmm. to white supremacy, right? And so there's just, I think, a lack. So I say all that to say this, that the BLM, M4BL, And I think those who take on some of those popular phrases, I can't breathe, are, I would argue, are being complicit in a narrative that, again, is pleading for, inclusion into white people's notions of humanity. And I think that's why notions of Pan-Africanism for many are so offensive, because it is disruptive to that very dynamic.
If you are joining us now, this is the Counter Narrative Show. We're talking to Davon Love about his recent article, Cracker Democracy, the Emergence of the Progressive Mainstream. I'm gonna go over to the chat. I'm way behind. I'm 17 comments behind, so I apologize if I don't get to you. D. Jones says, I have always found it interesting that the Black man is feared in society by white people, but in essence, it is them who have committed the most violence against us, but they have fear of us. Donna Van Hook mentioned, I guess she's talking about the mischaracterization. She says, angry Black woman. She says, because we refuse to be abused. Someone else said Black power. Those are the only ones that I could see now, but there are several others. Something that you just said reminded me of one of these quotes. It was just like so many quotes in here. I was just like, I got to calm down with the quotes. But it's related to what you just said. And in your piece, you say, Black people have been socialized in America to believe that subjecting ourselves to the violence of white society is a virtue. And what that reminds me of, turn the other cheek and love thy neighbor. And you provided some examples of what that is now. I can't breathe, it's still this thing of like, I don't know, there's a way of still not necessarily turning the other cheek, but you are pleading with them to see you as a human, as opposed to something like Black power that says, I have, armed resistance or whatever resistance. I'm curious. This actually isn't in one of the questions that I had before, but I am curious. I hear a lot of conversations connected to Black liberation, and so much of the conversation is connected to Black economic power. And then there's the conversation, of course, of Black political power. Where do you see that will be probably the most impactful in moving the dial forward?
Yeah. So I'm gonna foreground my answer. There's a brother named Dr. Jared Ball. He's got his book, The Myth and Propaganda of Black Buying Power. Highly recommend people read it because he engages this debate. And so there are a few things about this. One is that because I think people misunderstand his point, right? Because I think people interpret his work to mean that building independent Black institutions is not important, right? Or that Black people buying from other Black people, supporting other Black people is not important. And that's not his point in the text. His point is that, it is public policy that is the biggest driver of resources. So when we talk about things like we need to buy Black and circulate money in the community, and then people have this figure, this $1 trillion spending power. The notion of spending power is a nonsensical term because spending, you're a consumer. In terms of power, doesn't come from being a consumer. Power comes from being a producer, right? And so when people say spending power, that's a term that's created by commercial advertising companies and the commercial press as a way to designate the ability for people to make them rich. Right. So that's what spending power really means. Right. And so if we actually look at the actual capital that Black folks have, Black people today have roughly the same percentage of wealth of this country that we had on the eve of the Civil War, 0.5 of 1%. Right. Average white family has 16 times the wealth of an average Black family. Right. And it could go on and on and on. So and so most of that is driven by public policy. Right. The reason why corporations spend billions of dollars in lobbying is because they know the ability to shift resources has to do with policy. Right. Now, I don't think now it's my position that I don't think we have to prioritize one of them together. Right. But I think in terms of the relationship between the two, building economic self-sufficiency is something that can only be empowering to Black people if we have the political apparatus to make sure that we're able to shift resources and shift policy in a way that protects our community. Otherwise, if we just focused on the economic portion, normally the people that benefit from that are Black upper class, upper middle class, and middle class aspirants that are able to benefit from some modicum of economic improvement. What the political part does is that if we organize ourselves as a community to politically have power, then it creates the opportunity for more of us, the masses of Black people, to be able to hold our entire community accountable. So there's not just a handful of us that are getting ahead, but we're actually doing things politically that benefit the whole of our community.
You mentioned on more than one occasion when I talked to you about African or Afrocentric or African-centered advocacy. What does that look like?
Yeah, so I think in many respects, LBS is working to practice that. When we talk about, and it's kind of what you said in the beginning about design. Peoples of that, all peoples throughout world history develop things within their culture, approaches to food, reproductive justice, governance, money. Like peoples develop systems to deal with those kinds of things. One of the tragedies of our current moment is that we are all socialized to see Europe and European history and American European history as the center of the universe. There are all different kinds of approaches to these human issues that then are left off the table if all we know is the history and sociology of European societies. And so, for instance, we think about things like governance. This guy named Bruce Johansson, getting through a book he wrote, Forgotten Founders, where he talks about the fact that many of the people who wrote the US Constitution were observers of the democratic processes of the Iroquois Confederation, right? Northeast, what we call United States, they were observers of their democratic process and modeled their democratic process off of the Iroquois. And so it actually, the narrative makes more sense, because what white folks will say is, these founders just had a divine inspiration of this democratic experiment that just is unprecedented in world history. And just what's so silly about that is, how would people who had never experienced democracy just randomly craft the most democratic, so-called document ever? They had to have seen it somewhere, right? And so Johansson provides the evidence for the fact that they observed those democratic processes. So when we talk about like African-centered forms of advocacy, for me, the idea is it's about using the cultural and intellectual resources of bodies of work of people of African descent and to use it. But one of my criticisms of, my fellow African-centered, scholars and theorists is that a lot of times we'll talk about the African-centered theory, but in terms of how to actually use it.
Right.
And I think in Baltimore, I think we actually have a good number of folks who actually use African-centered theory, right? And actually use it in practice. So I think about like programs like WombWorks, right? Like they're using the methodology of peoples of African descent and using it, to teach drama, theater, self-discovery, identity. They're using and putting it into practice, right? And so I think that's a big part of when we talk about African-centered advocacy. It's about using, that body of knowledge as a part of the advocacy. And one key piece of, what I would describe as African-centered paradigm of advocacy is that historically, one of the things that happens, I was on a panel earlier today, it was a panel about voting rights. Many times people narrate the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the 65 Voting Rights Act as the same thing, all right, or it's more similar than they were. So the 64 Civil Rights Act was about public accommodations, opening up public accommodations. But the Voting Rights Act was something that was produced. So the Civil Rights Act was squarely in the civil rights movement space. But voting rights, this was where King was starting to interact more and be more adjacent to many Pan-African and Black nationalist grassroots organizers. And King himself understood that there were, the Black Belt of the South, a string of majority Black counties in the South. And the argument was, well, if you just give people the right to vote, they're not going to have to protest for, to be included. They'll just have power. And so I think a part of, African forms of advocacy is understanding that if we're talking about voting rights that emerged out of the idea of seizing power, that's different than I think what gets talked about in mainstream voting conversations, which is about Black inclusion into the Democratic Party mainstream. We need more Black people to vote in the Democratic Party mainstream, as opposed to, people talk about Fannie Lou Hamer, the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, building an independent grassroots entity that was attempting to see Black people in the Democratic Party convention in order to exercise power over the policies of the party. And so for me, African-centered forms of advocacy is about recognizing the importance of building power independently as the basis for whatever power that we wield, as opposed to an approach that's about more Black inclusion in the mainstream institutions.
Right. If you've tuned in, you're watching the Counter Narrative Show. We're talking to Davon Love about his recent article, Cracker Democracy, the Emergence of the Progressive Mainstream. Going over to the chat, Donna Van Hook says, turn the other cheek, nah, so you could punch me in the other one. Janine says, can you share more on what do you think it will take to get towards building and sustaining Black-owned and operating infrastructure regarding food access and education? D asks, it is expected, or she says, it is expected for us to lay down and be harmed. I believe Black churches play a huge role in this, and that is a virtue to accept mistreatment. That is a virtue to accept mistreatment. And then Jenny also says, do you see an increase in grant funding as a means of disaster management? Yes. And if so, what are your thoughts on how to get off the hamster wheel and move towards economic sovereignty? So the first question she asked was around sharing more about what you think it will take to go towards building and sustaining Black-owned operating infrastructure regarding food access and education.
I mean, I would say, the answer to that, it's one of those things that I think conceptually is easy and straightforward. It's just a matter of the will to do it. We have to support the institutions in our community that are doing it. We got to support the Black Yield Institute. We got to support the Black Church Food Security Network. We got to support the independent Black educational formations we have. Pleasant Hope has a Reader's Cross. There are a variety of other like independent Black community of academic scholars, which is an independent Black educational institution. These are institutions that we have to build up, replicate, and invest in, and advocate that they get the resources they need to continue to grow, thrive, and be sustainable. The bigger they grow, the more effective that we're able as a community to build infrastructure around those organizations. So I would say, it's one of those things that it's not complicated. It's just a matter of the will to do it, and the support from the community to get the investment in those organizations so they can grow.
Yeah. There's so much to what you just said in terms of just the awareness that there are so many organizations doing some of the work. When I did a show on, I think it was like urban farming, there were so many organizations just within Baltimore that are focused on urban farming, that have fresh fruits and vegetable distribution, giveaways and things like that. That it's just like, people aren't aware of. Just support people who are out there doing that work. And the other question is, do you see an increase in grant funding as a means of disaster management? And if so, what are your thoughts on how to get off the hamster wheel and move towards economic sovereignty?
So that's a complicated one, because I think it really depends on your role, right? So one of the things that I'm super clear about, LBS is a political organization, right? We're not a direct service organization. Even though we do educational things, we're not an educational institution. Like we are first and foremost a political organization. And so being a political organization means that there's certain things that we need to do and certain things that it does not make sense for us to be connected to, that it may make more sense for others. So when it comes to, for instance, for grants, LBS, I would say over the past 4 or 5 years, there's only like one grant that we consistently got. All the rest of our money, and that probably accounts for maybe 1/8 of our resources. The rest of our money is sustainers, so individual people that go on our website to be sustainers and give us money once a month, and fee for service. Like that's the biggest portfolio of how we bring in money. And that is important for a political organization, because if we were sustained by grants, people can make phone calls, take our money away, right? Because we're set up the way we're set up. And even on the fee for service side, the contracts we get is because we're effective at doing what we do, right? So you don't have to believe in Black liberation if you want someone to teach you. I do a lot of workshops on youth development, like youth leadership development, stuff like that. I have a track record in doing that. I can teach people how to effectively do that. And so you don't have to be a Pan-Africanist to want someone to come in and teach you some skills to do that. So that makes sense for us as a political organization. If you are a youth serving organization, it probably does make more sense for you to receive certain kinds of grants and certain kinds of like government assistance and resources. So this for me is where we have to have an ecosystem, right? Because it's LBS's job. We see it as our job to get more of these grants to the right organizations, to get more of these public investments in the right organizations. And so I think, and so part of it is people, and we've had people do things like, Davon so-and-so is giving us trouble. We can't say a whole lot because, our money comes from over there. Can y'all do something about that? Right. And that's the whole point of having a community and having an ecosystem, because we're the political organization. That's our job. Mm-hmm. Right. So that people can continue to do the work. Because if what you're doing is helping to raise the minds of young Black kids, then that's what you should be doing. Right. Now, be sustainers for LBS, because it helps to sustain us to be able to do the political work. But, so it's important for people to be real clear about what their particular line is. Now, in terms of eventually being independent and not having to rely on these institutions, I think that's a combination of, folks having to build a business plan that takes a long time, right? But to build a business plan to eventually wean off of it, and just have a mind for thinking about revenue streams in addition to grants, so that eventually folks can find ways, to not be relying on things like that. A quick example: there's so much written material that our young people are exposed to that, school districts pay for. Why not make it a point to make sure that the materials that we pay for are materials from people of and from our communities that sustain their institutions? Right. So this is just an example of what I mean in terms of, prioritizing what you do, what your lane is, but also just being mindful of alternative revenue streams, so that as you begin to wean off of the grants, that you're able to have something else to replace it.
Right. If folks have any more questions, feel free to go ahead and put it in the chat as we get closer to wrapping up. So our conversation and your article remind me a bit of Harold Cruz's work, talking about the role of the Black intellectual. I've also thought a bit about what Du Bois might say about the role, and about what Booker T. Washington might say as a role. Since I don't have them here to confirm what they might think, I'm curious for you, what do you feel like is the role of the Black intellectual in our time today?
It's interesting. I like talking about, I think, the way that the conversations, particularly regarding Du Bois and Booker T. Washington, are rendered, because I think it's really fascinating. It's really fascinating in terms of the interplay between the two kind of approaches. Most people, I think, who've been exposed to Booker T. Washington are exposed to his autobiography, Up From Slavery. I argue that the more important text of his is My Larger Education, which is a collection of essays where he talks about, he actually has some chapters where he talks about approaches to teaching, which I think is actually really useful for educators. And he also talks about, what he did to build up Tuskegee and to build up his institution. And, Du Bois was one of the people who was critical of Booker T. Washington's program. He has a chapter in My Larger Education, I think loosely titled like the Boston Intellectuals. And he uses this analogy of a frog where he says that, you're in a cabin, you're listening to a frog, someone tells you, I can go get you 1,000 frogs because I'm listening to the frogs and get you 1,000 frogs. And by the time he comes back, he's like, it was only 3. And his point was that the frogs sounded like 1,000, but really were only representative of a small group. Mm-hmm. And that was what he described and characterized as the Boston intellectuals. A handful of Black folks who were highly placed in elite that had a big megaphone, but actually were only a small minority of the community. Mm-hmm. And when you actually look at Booker T. Washington, even though he was in many respects an accommodationist to white philanthropy, he was hugely popular amongst Black people. Mm-hmm. And he spent a lot of his time when he traveled going to Black churches, talking about his educational program. So to your question about like, what's the role of Black intellectuals? I think a part of the way that Booker T. Washington gets misunderstood is that I think he gets misunderstood as a person who is a sycophant to white, accommodationism. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Booker Washington saw himself as playing a game. Mm-hmm. He saw himself as trying to kind of outsmart, and he even says in My Larger Education that he didn't like most of the white folks that he had to interact with. Mm-hmm. Right. But if you look at, for him, an intellectual is a person that can actually make things happen and put things in motion. Mm-hmm. But and so that's one piece. And that's not to kind of disparage Du Bois, because a part of what is important about Du Bois was the importance of political theorization and giving us the tools we need to engage in politics. In many respects, Booker Washington was the prerequisite to a W.E.B. Du Bois. Mm-hmm. That if you're able to build an organized set of institutions that you control, then it gives you, then it's only going to make sense that you got to get involved in politics, mm-hmm. right? And so I think the role of intellectuals is to be resources to particular arenas of civil society that we have to be active and actively contribute to giving tools for us to actually do things in our community. And I would argue a part of the failure, I think, of many, I would say, Black public intellectuals is that while the material may be titillating and stimulating intellectually, mm-hmm. I just don't think enough of it actually empties into actual efforts that we can see and are observable in improving the conditions in our community. And I think that's why I think the masses of Black people are not that engaged or impressed with mm-hmm. many Black public intellectuals, because they just don't see in their regular lives mm-hmm. fingerprints of them doing things that help to make their lives better.
Mm-hmm. No, I totally get that. I've definitely felt that way, even more specifically, not to get too far off, when it comes to womanism or Black feminist thought, just in the ways in which it is intellectualized, but not shown in everyday practices. Like, there are ways in which I could see my grandmother and I could see my mother behaving and acting these things out, but some of the people who know Black feminist thought cannot make that connection. They could read Audre Lorde and they could read, Bell Hooks and all these other folks, but they can't make the correlation between it in everyday practice. And if we can't bridge that, then what are we doing? Before I let you go, I want to ask you, tell us more about what LBS is up to, what is next for you, and how can people contact you. Actually, before you do that, give folks a bibliography, because people be asking me, what are some of the things we mentioned? So I'm going to say first, check out Davon's article, Cracker Democracy, the Emergence of the Progressive Mainstream. Another thing that was mentioned was the quote.
When Africa Awakes by Hubert Henry Harrison. That's where the quote comes from.
Yep, check that out. I would say check out Harold Cruz's The Role of the Black Intellectual. Check out Booker T. Washington, specifically that chapter on, what did you say, My Something Education?
So the book is My Larger Education.
My Larger Education, check that out. What else did we do? Can you think of anything else that we mentioned?
I mean, I talked about Kwame Ture. People should read Black Power, seminal text. I think it's really important.
Yeah. Yeah, so those are a few. So don't say that I didn't give you any. All right. All right, tell the people about what you're up to next. How can they reach out to you, follow you in a non-stalkerish social media sort of way?
So things we're working on. So LBS is currently doing some police accountability advocacy in Annapolis. We've been advocating for the repeal of the Law Enforcement Officer Bill of Rights, but also making sure that which is it's state law that gives police all these protections above and beyond what they need and makes it hard for them to be held accountable. And so, but it has to be replaced with something. And so we're working to try to make sure it gets replaced with the ability for the community to have control over law enforcement. So that's vitally important. We're also working on a piece of legislation called Anton's Law, named after Anton Black, who was killed by police officers on the Eastern Shore back in 2019. And it's a piece of legislation that would amend the Maryland Public Information Act. Currently, police disciplinary records are prohibited from public disclosure. And so we're trying to move that into the category where the public can request information about officers' disciplinary records. If you look at many of the police killings that have happened in Maryland and around the country, normally officers that have either seriously harmed somebody or killed somebody have a record, a pattern. So if the public had access to that information, we would have been able to get some of these officers off the force soon. So we're working on that. And we, and a few other legislative efforts, but that's kind of the main one. Additionally, we have the Black Arts and Entertainment District, which I believe you're the chair of the board. So we're partners on the board of the Black Arts District. And so just doing work to try to build that institution up to help, empower Black creatives and to strengthen West Baltimore. And then we're going to continue to just, we have States of the Street House podcast too, that gives you updates on our legislative stuff. So please check that out. That's on all our Facebook and our social media. And then we're also, partners in working on the Baltimore City Children and Youth Fund. So we look forward to there being more public information about what's happening with that. And just some of the ways that we want to continue to help build the infrastructure for community-based organizations to serve our youth. So those are some of the major projects that LBS is working on. You can get us at lbsbaltimore.com. We're LBS Baltimore on or Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle on all your relevant social media, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. And so you can follow us on any of those platforms. Last thing I'll say is that, and then this goes back to our legislative advocacy, it's really important to us. It helps a lot when we put out action alerts, when people contact their legislators. It really helps a lot. Like the ability for LBS to have the leverage that we have in the legislature. It seems small, but it makes it so that we're able to actually put more pressure on legislators to do the right thing. And so we thank people who've already been doing that with us, because again, it really helps. So there you go.
If people aren't on your newsletter where they get those alerts, how do they get on a newsletter so that they could get those alerts?
If you go to the website, lbsbaltimore.com, there's a tab that you can sign up to be on the listserv, and you just put your information in and you get on the listserv.
Awesome. Thank you again. Thanks so much for everyone who is watching live, and even if you're watching it later on the recording, thank you for stopping by. This has been the Counter Narrative Show. We've been talking to Davon Love about his article, Cracker Democracy, the Mergers of the Progressive Mainstream. If you haven't already, please check it out. You can find it at lbsbaltimore.com. I believe I usually go there and go under publications, but I think there's also other resources there as well. So thanks everyone for watching.
Yeah, thank you.
I need to know everything, who and the what and the where, I need everything. Trust me, I hear what you're saying, but act like it's new what you're telling me. I'm curious, George, I hop in the Porsche, it's 5 and a horse, I'm ready for war, I'm coming for throats, to turn to a ghost, I need to know everything.